Welcome. I'm Natalis Kinkedos. You probably know me as Alex Cubed on some of the other chats, and Artisetos Sidoregnatos going to join a little later to cover some of our practice. We are some of the new Samutanktos of Sepânioi Rotî. I'll be introducing protection cultists as part of our custom, with various approaches to incorporate protection to our daily lives. We don't have a Gaulish name for this cultist yet because it changed a little bit as we were working on it and developed. So that's something we're hoping to flesh out as we go along. Next slide. So protection is inherent to our relationship with the Dewoi. Healing's a big one. Protection from disease or injury, guarding boundaries, warding from evil, protection in war and justice. What it comes down to is that the Dewoi help us deal with the difficult parts of our life so that we can flourish. They let us experience life to its full potential through their power. Next slide. And an extension of that is that followers of the Dewa were an extension of their influence. Any acts that we perform is influenced by them and affects our relationship with them. So, as members of Sepânioi Rotî, when we engage in devotional acts of protection, it's as a way to further our relationship with the Dewoi and with our communities, with our loved ones, with everybody around us. And we see that at all as a kind of a holistic endeavor. Next slide. So yeah, within those communities, we all engage in hospitality with those around us. We all have daily dealings with our family, our friends, strangers. So to me, it's one of the most prominent member aspects of protection cultists in our daily lives, and I'm going to start with that. On the next slide, I want to start by going over the Gaulish virtue of hospitality of Oigetokaria. Obviously, Nellis went over this earlier, and I'm going to guess Nellis probably wrote this. I pulled this from the Tuta Galation site. The new to Sepânioi Rotî, of course. How we all interact with others, core part of our value system. But I think that this is a beautiful definition that captures the balance between one's own comfort as a host, duty to guests. Balance is at the heart of our practice in Sepânioi Rotî, so I'm going to try and expand on this by looking at ways that we can incorporate this virtue into our practice as Galatis. So the next slide, we have the circle of gifting. Like we mentioned in the introduction presentation, our tradition is, as in many, offerings to the gods are part of a cycle. It's one that we participate in out of gratitude and benefit to those around us. The we give for you have given, you give to us that we may give to others. It's the foundational aspect of our relationship with the Dewoi. The you give to us that we may give to others is at the core of hospitality cultists, where we extend that circle to our friends, our family, our guests, our hosts, strangers who need our help. In essence, we view every act of hospitality and of giving as part of our devotional practice and as part of the role the gods play in our lives. This can take on many forms. The most common ones that come to mind are exchanging food and drink, providing a safe place for others, emotional support of our loved ones. But there's more that we can learn from the Gauls and their gods to tell us about hospitality. On the next slide, we have Diodorus Siculus. Noted that the Celts invite strangers to their banquets, and only after the meal would ask their names and what they need. Nellis touched on this as well with people coming through town and making sure they're taken care of before asking them any questions about why they're there or what they need. The account is Greek, but it touches on the Greek hospitality, which is called xenia. So seeing this Gaulish form of xenia appear in a Greek account, it gives us a glimpse into their shared values. We can assume that part of the close cultural ties between the Gauls and the Greeks was their shared approach to hospitality. If two cultures have similar approaches to hospitality, they're going to interact much better and on a daily basis. And so we're going to look at a little bit of Greek approach to hospitality, Greek xenia, as a means to inform us about Gaulish hospitality. So the next slide again to Homeric hospitality accounts in Greek literature, especially through Homer, is that the unwavering devotion to xenia it's essentially a test of values. Virtuous characters get rewarded, while those who ignore the rights of a guest or host are punished. So it's an encompassing virtue for those who have power, and it covers quite a bit. Like generosity from wealthy characters is in Homeric tales is expected, and there's an implicit protection granted by being the guest to strangers. These wealthy, virtuous figures consistently also whatever it is the guests need most, like the Gaulish chieftains of Diodorus's account, or Gaulish nobles, or whoever may have been throwing these feasts. What I find really interesting, looking at this Greek lens of hospitality, is that Zeus is the patron god of Xenian hospitality. His role as a storm god, if you're looking at it from a Proto-Indo-European kind of, or an Indo-European umbrella, has the implications of justice and order, and it's at the core of the relationship with hosts and guests. That justice and order ties in that it's a social contract between strangers, between people who care about each other. So I don't think it's a logical leap to view Tyrannus, who is at the head of our custom, in the same role for Gauls, or for anyone who worships the Dewa, especially for those of us who view the wheel as that strong symbol of order, justice, and reciprocity. So on the next slide, give that which is most needed. I think the core of what I just covered was that the ancients would have focused on food, drink, safe walls, and a hot bath as initial offerings to guests. But they also lived in a world where those were guaranteed needs of any traveler you might encounter. Not to say that it isn't still the case. So the kings and heroes of the tales would offer what they expected was most needed off the bat, and then ask, what else do you need? Those are still obviously important things to this day, but in the modern world, there's so many other needs that we might be able to fulfill for those around us. Depending on your relationship with whoever is in need in this case, you might be in a good position to help them, or you might not be the right person for them at the moment. But through compassion and the giving cycle, we have a duty to try and understand what they really need and what we can truly do to help them. We can turn to the Dewa for guidance here, either through communion or interpretation, like meditating on it, interpreting their philosophy, what they can teach us. But even in our modern world, we can try to gain an understanding of the needs of the people around us as a devotional act, whether that's through technology or more traditional means, and practice the lessons taught to us by the Dewa. So on the next slide, I get into some devotional acts of hospitality. Like I said, these can apply to many different Dewa, but as I concluded earlier, Tyrannus is at the core of hospitality cultus for Sepânioi Rotî. Any act of reciprocity with a loved one or member of the community or stranger can be an extension of the giving cycle, including with Tyrannus. I have a few straightforward devotional acts on this slide, particularly, like purposefully creating a safe place in your home for a guest. This can be done actively, like saying a prayer or making an offering to a protective Dewa, or it can be a passive act by just going through the ritual of preparing the space. Changing the sheets, making sure they have what they need, cleaning up the space, and maybe intentionally acknowledging the divine protection that is afforded by that process. There are some Dewa, some protective Dewa like Camulus Brigantia, Kokidius, or the Matrone that might be applicable for that, as well as Tyrannus. I have here too, cleaning a shared space. So I know a lot of us like to pick up garbage from the areas in our neighborhoods and clean up shared spaces, which can be an act of love towards the nature spirits or local spirits, but also towards protective Dewa like a Tutatis. Again, a prayer and offering won't hurt, but they aren't necessary. The act itself, done with intention, can be an offering. Traditional guest and host interactions are still active today, of course. So exchanging host and guest gifts can be one of those acts. I've stopped telling people they don't have to bring anything. Everybody always asks, like, what can I bring if I'm coming for dinner? And I used to be like, I've got it. I plan for everything. I over plan for things. So I generally tell them not to bring anything, but I finally clued in that it's woven into the fabric of our society to exchange gifts when you come. So the bread or wine or whatever you're sharing, dessert, it isn't necessarily offered directly to the Dewa, but if your guests share your values, you can certainly do that together. But the act of reciprocity can be an offering to the Dewa, especially to those that they feel best apply. I have donating food regularly or at holidays there. I mean, strongly encourage donating food or other needed supplies regularly or during holidays. I think good example of that in the overculture is there's always can drives around Christmas and Thanksgiving. So I mean, taking part in those can be devotional. But also encourage donating during our own holidays. Nella's mentioned in September. I forget the name of the Iwas, but dedicated to Katubodua. And I think that that's really important because these often fall during lulls. Like our holidays often fall during lulls in between overculture events where you get these acts of mass donation. So I think that I think that's something that we can all as a group engage in and try to help fill that void. I plan to do this type of offering coming up. I've been trying to narrow down a hunting dewoi as one of my patrons. So I want to donate something in their name, since any hunting dewoi, core to their protective aspect is as a provider of the tribe. So on the next slide I have yeah, okay, there we go. On the next slide I have a few more some more unorthodox devotional acts of hospitality, like the very act of celebrating with others can be devotional. Hospitality is about sharing joy with others. Dewoi of life like Bellanos, or any dewoi of prosperity can be worshipped by making the most of our time on earth. So I mean, anything from like hosting a movie night to going clubbing is celebrating life, whatever brings you joy. It can be acknowledged as the impact that the dewoi has had on our lives and sharing in that joy with other people. On the other hand is sharing in pain. So like we learned from the Greeks, the dewoi encourage us to offer what's most needed. Depending on your relationship with the person, it can take a lot of different forms, like I said. But if you find yourself offering much needed support to someone who's struggling or grieving, I encourage you to reflect on it either afterwards or ahead of times and consider how the dewoi's protection may have helped that person through you. You are a vessel for your dewoi's beliefs, or the beliefs that they teach us. And I mean, we have that duty to ourselves as well to uphold our own boundaries and maintain the crucial balance in our own space. The climax of the Odyssey involves the hero slaughtering the suitors who have time and again rejected their duties as guests and shown no generosity. It's a parable. Don't go killing any guests. But it shows that being a respectful guest is just as important as being a generous host. And we can rely on the dewoi for the strength to build or find a place to be comfortable in and to build our boundaries. I think Nunos in particular, as a god of mediation, could be considered as a dewoi to be considered when upholding that truth. So getting to the next section, we've got warding horns, which Nunos actually leads us pretty nicely into. So here we'll be looking at kind of an odd devotional approach, which is looking at horns as a protective symbol. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but I'll try to move through it at a good clip. So the next slide, horns are apotropaic. I've been practicing that all week. It means to say they're a warding symbol against evil. So the symbolism of horns, of course, well explored in our community. Protection, fertility, prosperity, divine madness. They're all things tied to horn symbolism. In our exploration of devotional practice of protection, we came to the conclusion that horns can be used to invoke this warding power of the dewoi to protect us from things beyond our control. Particularly, this can be applied to the hearth and matters of wealth, prosperity, as well as our communications with the dewoi. On the next slide, I've got there are horned creatures that appear in art across the Mediterranean, but the Gaulish artifacts point to a recurring theme. So when we look at Gaulish, use of horn imagery, we find there's quite a bit of crossover with their neighbors, of course, and that recurring symbols in certain areas can give us a glimpse into their ancient symbolism. Rams, goats, ibex, stags, and the horn serpent as well were common motifs in Gaulish and neighboring art. The Celtic art style can make it really hard to decipher like one animal from another, like a ram from a goat from an ibex, depending on the cultures around them. Some of these are more prominent than others. the ibex in particular in what is now the Middle East. But then we also have, depending on the geography, you're going to see different animals crop up more likely. In terms of actual objects with this symbolism, votive offerings were really common, but then again, so are goats and sheep as sacrifices. So, I mean, that's not to say that we can disregard them as having meaning. I think that they even hold more meaning. But in terms of daily life, we can see them appearing on money very, very frequently, on wearable objects, and especially objects suspected to be functional hearth tools. I'll get into that a little later. From these objects, we can extract symbolism of protection, prosperity, and divinity, either benevolent divinity or terrible power, depending on how you interpret things. On the next slide, if we look at the history of protective horn imagery, we see a lot of commonalities across the Mediterranean and their related cultures. In Hallstatt, Gaul, amulets were commonly made of antler and then carved into different symbols for various purposes like health and fertility. Later on, we see war implements like helmets and swords and daggers that have been found with horns, as like the helmets having actual horns on them. The Waterloo helmet is an example of that. We also see ram and horn serpent imagery appear on helmets and swords, weapons, that sort of thing. And of course, both the horn helmet and the horn serpent appear on the Tyrannus plate of the Gundestrup cauldron, which we'll get into later. Beyond war, jewelry, of course, was extremely common, featuring rams and horns, especially on pins and torques that ended with ram's heads. There's clearly a long history of horns in wearable forms and used in war. Getting into the next slide, rams guarded the hearth. These were very closely tied to each other. So across the ancient civilizations closest in culture to Gaul, Iberia, Thrace, Greece, especially places that worship the Devooi, we've encountered hearth objects featuring rams. But in Gaul, these were absolutely everywhere. They were much more common there than anywhere else. In fact, unique to Gaul were these tall tripod kind of candlestick type objects. That's what archaeologists think they might have been, which on each side, as they kind of curled at the top, featured a horned creature. Usually a ram, a stag, and a goat. Sometimes there were some variations there. The most common hearth objects in Gaul, though, were stone or baked earth rams, like the archaeological drawing depicted here. They likely held firewood, either in or outside of the fire, like we see in Greece, and I think in Iberia as well, particularly, we see objects that seem to have been made for holding firewood. But the one that I'm showing here seems to have been for holding back the fire inside of the hearth, based on the scorching that they exhibit when they're dug up. That's the best guess. What's interesting about these rams is they'll feature plant imagery. You can see that there's like a frond and some chevron patterns on this one. Garlands are also a common one that appear. Both the palm frond and the garland are found alongside rams and horned serpents in other Gaulish art, especially the highly stylized forms. These might also be apotropaic symbols of life and fertility, which kind of continued into the overculture later on. And they all might have started the same pattern, but they became increasingly regional. Like you see palm fronds in one region, garlands in another, and then chevrons in another. So this may have evolved as the practice spread from one common source. There were other hearth objects that were shaped like other animals, like dogs especially, which are another chthonic symbol of protection, similar to rams. And later on, horses, which might have had a sort of psychopomp role, considering upon its popularity as a warrior goddess in Roman Gaul, which is around when we see the horse ones pop up. So these all point towards my interpretation being apotropaic objects used at the center of one's house custom and hearth custom, likely ancestor worship or maybe regular ritual, which is something that we can adapt for ourselves in our practice. On the next slide, I get into the horn serpent, which is a really interesting facet of horn symbolism because we get insight into the horns without the associated animal, the ram or the goat or the ibex. especially the snake. The snake, like it's just a regular snake in symbolism, is also a symbol of chthonic fertility. So the horns seem to amplify those aspects, particularly in matters of wealth. In Cisalpine Gaul and a little bit into towards the north into like modern day Normandy, but especially in Cisalpine Gaul across the Alps, the horned serpent is found on an incredible number of coins, cementing its role as a symbol of fertility via prosperity, likely due to its association with Nunos and Gaulish Mercury. The Matrone are also associated with the horned serpent. The Matrone cover a wide range of domains, but if we look at Miranda Green, her explanation of the horned serpent as being of fertility, healing in the underworld, all of those tie into the matrons, and the underworld especially, I think, ties into them as ancestor worship. That the family being tied to previous generations. Death and the horned serpent also go together on the famous Gundership cauldron. On the next slide, I have a panel where sacrificed warriors seem to be led off by the horned serpent in the top right. And then on the next panel, we see it reappear with a warrior wearing a horned helmet as he's grasping the wheel of Tyrannus. My personal gnosis and interpretation of these scenes is that it's an example of cosmic balance and cooperation. That we have this creature of chaos, but that's a warding spirit that leads a warrior to Tyrannus, who even though he's a god of order, imparts power or wisdom to this warrior. I know that's not how everybody sees it, but to me, that's where this the horned serpent might be a guide for the spirits of the dead, especially warriors. And it's like I said, it's personal gnosis, but it's especially built on the principles that I've outlined here. We also see the horned serpent appear on the Agri helmet, which if we go to the next slide is that image that I showed earlier. Oh, pardon me, I forgot to tell you to go to that slide. One more slide down. Here we go. So that's the cheek guard from the Agri helmet, and we see the horned serpent appear nestled in there. It's an incredibly well preserved piece of Celtic art. The protective imagery of a helmet, no matter how ceremonial, because this one was just a beautiful. I should have included a whole picture of it, but it's a beautiful piece of Celtic art, and likely not super functional, being that it's largely made of gold and other metals. But the horned serpent appears there, and there's another symmetrical spot on the other side of the cheek guard, and then there's on the other side of the helmet, there's another missing cheek guard. So there's been discussion on other creatures that might have fit in there. Like one theory that I saw was a bird-headed snake, being maybe a symbol of a protective order spirit versus a protective chthonic spirit. But for now, all we know is that this spirit was an important feature on a protective piece buried intentionally in a cave sanctuary without a corpse. It wasn't a grave good, but it may have been an offering to a chthonic deity, and this was certainly a chthonic creature. So all this combined leads me to view the horned serpent as a guardian deity of prosperity, health, and the souls of the dead. On the next slide, we can get into horns as a symbol of divine power. So horns might have been particularly tied to divine protection. And what I mean by that is that there seems to be scattered evidence placing rams and bulls and horns in between gods and mortals. Across the ancient world, from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, votive drinking horns had ram and bull-headed spouts, placing them directly between the gods and the worshippers. The one that I show here is from Persia. I just thought it was a really beautiful example. But similar horns were found almost all the way to the Rhine. It's interesting because these are actually conspicuously absent from Gaul and Britain. Like it reaches right up to, near the Rhine. Doesn't even quite, the finds don't quite reach that far. But we did find, by we I mean modern archaeologists, which I am not one, but archaeologists have found later decorative pieces, especially in the British Isles, that may indicate that other drinking implements like bowls or sort of cauldrons or pails made out of less durable forms like wood or horn may have existed in similar roles that would have then rotted away, and we don't have evidence of them. So I just wanted to mention these fascinating artifacts and maybe examine the place that they could have held in the cultures we're examining. More in Gaul and and Germany as well. We see stylized horn imagery in early Latin art, depicting them alongside bearded, crowned faces that may have had aspects of divinity, and very frequently had palm and palmette artistic elements, which in Greece and Rome, palms were, of course, associated with victory, but they're also symbolic of life and prosperity. The palms and palmettes actually became more prominent as time went on. We also see in this very stylized art, monsters like griffins and dragons being shown opposite of rams. This could imply like a divine protection as counter to divine fury. So rams versus dragons, or griffins being an interpretation of benevolence versus terrible power. So like I said at the start of the slide, this evidence is pretty fragmented, but this kind of the ram being in between people and gods kept coming up in these little bits and pieces. But the best case we have for horns and their divine power, of course, the horn deities, Nunos, Camulus, Beatucadros, Witris, and the horn British Devoy that pop up all over the place. And in these cases, we can interpret the horns as either benevolent, protective, or terrible as natural weapons. So on the next slide, I have Camulus, and this is a quote from Makana, talking about how the Mars of Gaulish inscriptions is more than a god of war. He's god of healing, fertility, and protection, guardian of his people, and of their material wealth, material prosperity, whether against disease or against hostile arms. So I make the case for more of a benevolent protection, looking at how the ancients view their horn gods. Camulus clearly has a protective element, a god of prosperity through protection. We see him referenced on the Mars Camulus Stein, which is a Germanic Roman stone carving from about 50 AD, with bay leaves, which was an apotropaic symbol as well. So Camulus's association with ram's horns may have been based on one depiction, but it's certainly very, very common in our shared gnosis, and his protective and prosperous aspects are core to horn cultus. And next we also have Nunos, who, of course, the horned one. His antlers have been interpreted in a lot of different ways. Suffice to say, horn cultus, they can be viewed as power to guard the boundaries and liminal spaces, such as trade. I've heard shared gnosis as well, that he has a reserved presence for most people. Sometimes that can flare, which I think really lines up well with the notion of horns as being benevolent or kind of terrible power if a Devoy is crossed, or to make their point. So as far as devotional acts go, on the next slide, I have a few different ways that we can use them as these symbols I've discussed. I have deer antlers and a goat horn on my altar as wording symbols. I'm new to ritual, new to this practice, and find them reassuring as I open myself up to new spiritual experiences. I intend to add more a ram sculpture. Having written this presentation and done this research, especially because my ancestor worship is sorely lacking, and I've been inspired by these hearth items of ancient Gaul. Wearable apotropaics are, of course, high on the list for everyday protection, daily protection, granted from the Devoy against evil forces. So I might make something out of antler or sculpt a horn pendant going forward. I have here mounting horned art above bed, crib, or doorways. We can invoke their power either with literal antlers or something a bit more abstract in the home. I wouldn't necessarily mount a deer skull in my baby's room, but I do have a little felt garland with his name and some woodland creatures above his crib, including a deer that has little antlers. And since writing this, it's just every day I kind of look at it, and it gives me this appreciation to the Devoy for protecting my family. It's not necessarily like as a means of asking for protection, but giving thanks for the specific form of their benevolence. And on the next slide, I have some kind of I have an odder one, which is I wasn't able to get out this year, but with all the travel restrictions. But shed hunting, which is collecting lost antlers of deer, is something that I enjoy doing. I don't have great luck at it, but it's just another reason to get out in the winter. They generally start losing them around the winter solstice. So if I'm lucky enough to find some next year, I plan to perform ritual and put them up thanking the Dewoi for their protection through the darkest nights. And the Horn Serpent is, of course, a huge symbol for prosperity. So I think wearables for any matters of wealth, including like salary negotiations, even if it's just carrying an image of her in your pocket, can't hurt. And I think it'd be keeping with how the ancients viewed this particular Dewoi, this spirit, and in practicing horn cultus. So that's the end of those sections. I'm going to hand things off to Artisetos, and he'll take us through social justice in protection cultus. Thank you.
Hi, yeah. I am Arto Sectos. I'm very, very new to SR. I'm not going to try saying it in full because I guarantee I will find some terrible way to butcher the pronunciation. Um, yeah, I'm gonna be discussing how some of the more historical aspects of um Gaul and Britain can be applied to modern day social justice and how we can use that to build upon our relationships with the Daewoi. If Kuno could move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to start off by discussing warriors for a second. Now, warriors from an ancient worldview were privileged members of the tribe. They Their whole job was to defend against violent threats and enforce barriers, protecting those in need within their tribe against the forces of chaos and beyond outside of those borders. Nowadays, however, clearly we're not all armed with swords and spears and shields and axes. Maybe not all of us, some of us might, but essentially nowadays there are similar roles that people that possess this privilege that warriors may have entertained could act with. We can use those of us with privilege can use and resources can use those to protect those who don't possess that privilege. We can create and maintain places of safety and joy against forces of chaos. If Kuno can move on to the next slide, please. And here's something that um, Natatis talked about quite a bit about Camelos's name in particular. Now, whenever I find Camelos and his etymology across the internet, you'll find that his name has often been either translated to the champion or the servant. However, to us, it would seem that both both attestations and ideas for what the name means are incredibly accurate. A hero and a true warrior serves their people instead of being served. A champion is, in a way, a servant. They hear what they need and do what they can do to do it. For example, the tale of Vercingetorix sacrificing himself to Rome for his people, and it shows how leaders should behave, their honor and duty to their people. If Kuno can move on to the next slide, please. Another historical example we can point towards is how the Gauls and Britons approached combat and war. Posidonius wrote of wars between tribes, where nobles and warriors would engage in small battles or single combat, taking each other's arms and wealth without harming the commoners or their lands. It was the warriors' duty to protect all, including those from the tribes they were fighting. Not everyone involved in a community would be warriors. They couldn't fight, and as such, warriors were expected to treat them with mercy. No valor or honor could be found in slaying innocents, and non-combatants could not be harmed. Now, there is a possible argument here in regards to modern day social justice for approach towards things such as anti-war demonstration. In discussing this, it can be surmised that with a lot of contemporary examples, war tends not to follow these rules anymore. And as such, we can be one way in which we can honor the Daewoi and promote honor and valor is to instead protest against these, act against these, and promote harmony with each other. Uno can move on to the next slide, please. And now we speak of generosity. Ariamnes, according to a 3rd century account, held a year-long feast for the entire country. Social justice is more than fighting things. It's caring for everyone that you can. This includes strangers. Diodorus Siculus wrote that the Celts invite strangers to the banquets, and only after their meal do they ask who they are and of what they stand in need. Nellos spoke of this earlier in regards to hospitality, and it shows that despite how removed we are in modern society, we can work towards the betterment of each other, work towards helping each other, providing resources, providing food for those who need it, and not only providing this to people we know, but sometimes we should provide this to complete strangers. That's as not everyone in this is. You won't probably know everyone in your community, and as such, building these connections and building these threads with each other is a wonderful way to build community, grow things such as mutual aid, and build upon this in honor of the Daewoi. Next slide, please. Now, what does this have to do with the wheel? Well, the way of life is one of hardship. Things change, and it's our duty to help each other weather the storm. However, sometimes things staying the same is what causes the most hardship. Stagnation without hope of change leads to oppression, suffering, rigidity. Sometimes you have to get rid of some parts that are forcing things to stick to foster new things that can provide help and betterment for your community. It's the way of the storm to destroy and to create. And so to foster growth and fight stagnation, we must also destroy that which holds us back. Next slide, please. And the Daewoi connect us, which is a wonderful way that suggests that regardless of individualism, we can't thrive if we don't value the community. Bonds of community are sacred and forged by the Daewoi to keep us strong. People can't be looking out for only themselves. That's the force of chaos. The Daewoi are our connections to others, to the world, to ourselves. We're focusing on the connections to others, how they teach us to interact with our community. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to discuss how some of these deities that we've talked about and some others can relate to this and other aspects of life. For example, Camelos is very important here. As a warrior god, he enforces the boundary, protecting the vulnerable from the forces that seek to harm them. Fostering in us strength and duty, we seek to emulate his example. His depiction as Ramhorn speaks to his role as both striker against those under his care, but also his role in shielding them. We've also included some devotional acts here, such as martial arts and active social justice, such as protecting those vulnerable and seeking out injustice, destroying systems that abuse. Kuno could move on to the next slide, please. We have Brigantia. Meaning the high or exalted one, Brigantia is extremely important. We see her here as a deity who helps us to build places without conflict and giving people a safe place to rest. Now, especially in regards to things such as social justice and fighting things that could hold us back and prevent us from moving forward, everyone forgets the importance of relaxation. There are times to work, but without rest, one can't be at their full strength. Brigantia is the voice that tells us to let go of our anger and to rest until the time comes to work. We can call on her to create spaces to discuss disputes amongst ourselves and those outside of our groups. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Now, here is a god that is personally very close to my heart. It's a deity that I am devoted to. Kokidius is a god who shows up in northern Britain along Hadrian's Wall, possibly horned. His name causes debate. Some have translated his name to mean the Red God, but a certain member of the Brittonic server that I come from states that it's more accurate to suggest the striker or the slayer. Is depicted as a hunter in a relief as a hunter armed with a bow and arrow, accompanied by a stag and a hound. On the other, he is a warrior, standing alone with a spear and shield. Amongst Brittonic polytheists today, he's seen as a provider, giving protection and food to those who need it. Now, you can emulate his example by donating food and acting strongly against those that bring harm to the community. Next slide, please. Now we have Garlands. He's seen by a lot of people, as has already been mentioned by others, as a mediator. The Horned One, a middle ground between depiction. His voice is the one that tells us to respect differences and to strive for balance. Too much order, as previously mentioned, leads to stagnation, rigidity, and oppression. Too much chaos leads to greed, selfishness, and destruction. Nunos teaches us that change is inevitable and necessary. You can emulate his example by settling disputes, enacting change, and working towards both our own goals and the goals of the wider society. Next slide, please. And lastly, we have Bellanos, a god of healing springs and healing in general. It is Bellanos who helps us to foster health in ourselves and others. Supporting each other after vast amounts of work is a sacred duty. We must care for our own. This doesn't mean we shouldn't also care for ourselves. For the sake of our own health, both physical and mental, Bellanos reminds us that in spite of the ways of the world, we should enjoy our lives and find beauty in the world the gods have given us. Devotional acts that may bring you closer or emulate his example includes anything that brings you joy and aiding others in their self-care. And can we move on to the next slide, please? And that's about it. Personally, I wanted to thank all of you for sitting through that and listening to us rant about horns and social justice for a while. I also wanted to thank, in front of you all, that I also wanted to thank Alex's role in doing this. I didn't provide as much as I probably should have, but his work here has been amazing and brilliant. And I don't think if I was left to do it, I don't think I'd get it done. But Alex does a lot.
I don't